First of all, there are a number of connections between the Neṣḥānā and the Zulkarnain pericope that cannot be limited to the fact that Alexander has horns and the protagonist in the Quran has an epithet of the two-horned one. It can't be limited to the fact that there is the story of a gate built to confine Gog and Magog. So the common points are much deeper.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another engaging episode of the Real Talk Podcast with your hosts, Tehran and Roxana. Today, we have a truly intriguing and thought-provoking topic on the Neṣḥānā d-Aleksandrōs, also known as the Syriac Legend of Alexander, that aims to challenge and reshape your ideas about the subject. To help guide us through the intricacies of this discussion, we are honored to have Dr. Tommaso Tesei with us, illuminating our understanding of this work in light of his latest monograph titled The Syriac Legend of Alexander's Gates, Apocalypticism at the Crossroads of Byzantium and Iran. Thank you, Professor Tesei, for joining us to talk about your latest work.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk about this topic. Even though my ideas about Zulkarnain, the Alexander Syriac legend, has kind of moved away from believing it was Cyrus, this topic is still interesting nonetheless. And seeing how you laid out your arguments and a lot of what was going on behind the composition of the work we're going to talk about, I found very intriguing. So Roxanne and I are extremely excited to talk about this. Could you please just introduce our audience to your latest book, The Syriac Legend of Alexander Gate? I understand that in this work, your views about the Neṣḥānā differ from your previous perspectives. Could you take us through what prompted this change in attitudes and how it shaped your new approach to the subject?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. Yeah, it was very interesting. Well, I would say that in general, my research philosophy is increasingly being inspired by this quote from an article I usually give my students to read. It's the advice of Gurdjieff to his daughter. Gurdjieff was Armenian mystic writer, and he made a list of I don't remember how many exactly, I have it here, so 83 advices to his daughter. And one of these, which I found pretty interesting and that I always love to share with my students, says, I will read it, so I will make sure I'm not misquoting. So it's the advice number 60, and it reads, do not defend your old ideas simply because it was you who said them. Okay?
I like that.
So, and I think that this is a very important perspective for a scholar, that our focus as scholars should always be on trying to get as close as possible to what is historically plausible. And there is nothing wrong with realizing that ideas that we have advocated in the past maybe are not correct, okay? Or maybe they were, but who knows? So maybe what I wrote in this book, maybe it will turn out it was not right and the previous view was correct, but that's not the point. The point is that we should not be scared when we find elements that appear to contradict what we said in the past, what we said and we wrote in the past. And this is exactly what happened to me. I was in Princeton at the time. I had the privilege to spend 1 year at the Institute of Advanced Study. And I was writing another book. So this book happened by accident. I was writing about the relationship between the Zulkarnain pericope and these legends about Alexander found in Syriac literature. And then I realized that this text, that the scholarly consensus mostly dated at least so far. I don't know if my book will help to switch a little bit this paradigm. But the scholarly consensus dated to the period of Heraclius. Well, I found reasons to believe that it had been composed a few decades earlier, and so I had this. I guess that psychologists would define this phenomenon as cognitive dissonance. That is when you start having that annoying feeling that your ideas start shaking a little bit. Well, I started writing down this small doubt I had as a footnote. Then the footnote became a paragraph, and then it expanded into a chapter, and it ended up being a monograph. So it was, it was very much how it went. It was interesting, an interesting process.
Yeah, I remember when I first reached out to you for the first podcast that we had on the topic of the legend of Alexander, and you told me that you had kind of went back on some of your ideas. I personally was a little upset just because I was so invested in your work leading up to that period to find out that, oh no, it's what I was buying into, the author of this work isn't so much anymore. So and it's really. And your book came out a lot faster than I thought. I hear academics complain about how long it takes for an article to appear in a journal. When you were talking about this monograph that you were developing, I expected to see it maybe in like the next 3 or 4 years. But our podcast was almost 2 years ago, and your book came out, within that time. So I was surprised to see it come out as fast as it did. So it must have been in the works when I had reached out to you the first time.
It was, I don't remember exactly, because I think the first time we talked must have been a couple of years ago.
Yeah, March 2022.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I was in the middle. I was still developing my ideas, but yeah, it went pretty fast. I mean, not fast enough. I mean, writing is always a very slow process.
Oh, well, on the topic of the Syriac legend of Alexander, which is drawn from the theme or motif, the Imitatio Alexandri, can you provide our audience with a brief synopsis of this thematic motif, dealing with its core elements and its historical context?
Okay, so yeah, the Imitatio Alexandri is an element that it is present in this Syriac Alexander legend, or Neṣḥānā d-Aleksandrōs. I mean, it's a Latin expression, which literally means the imitation of Alexander, that scholars usually use to define a phenomenon that seems to have been current in Roman political debate. Starting, I mean, there are different phases and periods. I would say that one peak of this Imitatio Alexandri was around the 2nd or 3rd century. But so in a few words, it consists on the attempt, or the alleged attempt by a Roman general or emperor, to reproduce the deeds of Alexander the Great against the Achaemenid Empire, with the obvious implication that new enemies and challenges on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire would represent some kind of recurring event as compared to the past, when Alexander had invaded the Persian Achaemenid Empire. The idea was that maybe a Roman emperor will repeat the deeds of the glorious Alexander. Now, it is unclear to what extent Roman generals or emperors actually engaged with this propagandistic dream exercise, or it was rather Roman historians that used these motif to make things more appealing to their audience. For sure, there were a few emperors who seem to have been pretty much into this phenomenon. One of those is for sure Caracalla. The interesting thing is that with the rise of the Sasanian dynasty, it looks like Roman emperors or their propagandists progressively took distance from this way of representing themselves for an obvious reason that no Roman emperor could dream, not even in his wildest dreams, to repeat the deeds of Alexander, because by the time it had become evident that the Sasanian Empire was there to stay. And that there are very interesting debates about whether the Sasanians themselves were looking at the Achaemenians as a possible model to rebut this Roman propaganda. I had started writing a book about that, but in this moment it is not moving forward. I'm focusing on other things.
Although it sounds interesting that there's a possibility that the Imitatio Alexandri were in response to what the Persians were trying to do with the Achaemenids. That's very interesting.
Maybe if there ever was an imitation of the Achaemenians from the Persian side, it must have been going the other way around. That is, as a reaction to the Imitatio Alexandri on the Roman side. But historians are very much debating whether there was this Achaemenian model on the Sasanian side, or it's rather Roman historians who are representing things that way. It's a very complex topic.
Sounds interesting nonetheless.
Very interesting.
In terms of when Western scholars first started really engaging with the sort of textual traditions, the early sort of textual tradition around Alexander, Budge's work in 1889 on the history of Alexander the Great sort of encompasses critical editions and translations of 4 key Syriac texts. Mm-hmm. Could you sort of elaborate on what those texts were, whether there were sort of discernible similarities among them, or do they present very distinct histories of Alexander? And what is the information we have on the sort of the source manuscripts of those texts?
Okay, so this is an excellent question, because these texts, especially my main focus here is on the Neṣḥānā d-Aleksandrōs, but the Neṣḥānā d-Aleksandrōs was edited for the first time together with other Syriac sources about Alexander, namely the Syriac version of the Alexander Romans, and then a homily attributed to Jacob of Serug, and then a few more texts that were edited in 1889 by Wallace Budge. This was the first time that these Syriac texts were brought to the scholarly attention, although there is actually a previous translation, English translation of the Neṣḥānā that did not receive much attention. I don't remember exactly. I think it was translated by Perkins, if I'm not wrong. But the translation was made starting from one manuscript only. So, and it did not receive much attention. So it was only after the publication of Budge's volume that this text started to gather a certain attention, not too much. And already 1 year after the publication of Budge's critical edition and translation, Nildeke published a study about these texts. So as for the relationship between the texts, it's pretty interesting that in the manuscript tradition, the Neṣḥānā has been transmitted as an appendix to the Alexander Romans, the Syriac version of the Alexander Romans, although it is a completely separate work. Okay, I wouldn't exclude that the author of the Neṣḥānā had knowledge of some version of the Alexander Romance, but I'm not very sure that by the time he was writing, the Syriac version of the Alexander Romance had already been produced. This is another very complex question. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about how this Syriac version of the Alexander Romance came into being, if translated from Greek or from Middle Persian. There are all these pending questions. But these are two completely different works. Okay, so it's though still interesting that by the time the author of the Neṣḥānā was writing, that at least according to my reading, we are in the middle of the 6th century, the Romance, the Alexander Romance, had probably been translated into Armenian. And this is interesting because as I suggest in the book, I don't go too deep into this question, but there are reasons to think that the author was coming from the Armenian region. There are a number of elements pointing to that idea, to that direction. So probably the Romance was very much present in the environment in which the author was active.
And in terms of what are the ramifications of the text being solely attested in sort of later manuscripts? Does this challenge, or does this create challenges for the possibility of tracing the text back to its original date?
Yeah, okay, so of course, I mean, it's always a challenge. Dating a text is always a challenge, and establishing the authorship always is. At the same time, it is very, very uncommon to find a manuscript of the text dating from the period in which the text was produced. Okay, so most, for instance, many of the works of coming from the Greek classical tradition are not transmitted in manuscripts dating back, let's say, to Herodotus. So just to give you an idea. So of course, it is a challenge, but at the same time, the fact that the manuscript is late doesn't mean that the text is late too. So the task of the philologist and of the historian is to find the elements within the text that allow to establish the dating.
You know, we asked that question because one of the arguments against the Neṣḥānā having influenced the Dhul-Qarnayn story was that the manuscript tradition that it's found in is late. So if the Neṣḥānā text is only attested later than the Quran via manuscripts, how do we discount that it was actually influenced by the Quran rather than vice versa? Because some people, when they find out that it was found in the manuscript tradition of 1889 by Budge, they say, well, that opens up the possibility that maybe the Quran influenced the Neṣḥānā.
Now, that's a good question. I mean, again, the fact that the text is certified only in later manuscripts doesn't mean that can't be more ancient. Again, I would say that there is an overwhelming scholarly consensus that the Neṣḥānā dates back at least to the 7th century. And in my reading, it dates rather to the 6th century. Now, there is here, when it comes with the connection to the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope, there are a few things to clarify. First of all, even if one established that the Neṣḥānā was composed in 630, just to stick to the previous scholarly wisdom that I challenged. Many people would still rebut this idea, saying that the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope occurs in a Meccan surah, so it was composed prior to 622. Actually, this is another argument that I read sometimes online. Sometimes I do actually have fun in following these debates. And the point is that the chronology of the Quran is not historically reliable. It's exegesis. So historically speaking, we have really no elements to prove that the pericope on the Dhul-Qarnayn was composed in Mecca before 622, because this chronology is based on exegesis, not on historical records. What is often presented as historical record is there are variations of this Asbab an-Nuzul, which are clearly written around the Quran and not inspired by historical knowledge. So, I mean, my take on this is that can you make the point that it was the Quran that has inspired the Neṣḥānā of Alexandros? Yes, you can, but working on the assumption that the Quran was composed in the early 6th century, at least, something that I'm not sure that many scholars would agree on this. So, I mean, I think that theologically you could still make the point. I'm not really in theology, but you could still make the point that if the Quran pre-exists, then it can inspire other works. But historically speaking, the Syriac legend predates the Quran of, I would say, 7 or 8 decades.
Wow. And, you know, in your moving to your monograph, the meat and potatoes of this conversation, in your monograph on the Neṣḥānā, you introduce a fresh perspective on overlooked aspects of Byzantine, Persian political debates. By bringing these marginalized debates to the forefront and reevaluating them, you suggest a potential earlier origin for the Syriac legend, challenging common assumptions and offering a recontextualized understanding of its political influence. Just getting into the debates, Nodika in 1890, as you've already mentioned, was arguably the first scholar to give the Neṣḥānā a critical analysis, from which he concluded that the work was composed sometime during the first quarter of the 6th century. This was based on his assumption that the Alexander song, also known as the pseudo-Jacob metric homily, by Jacob of Sarug, was dependent on the Neṣḥānā and was in fact written by Jacob, but the theories of Nodika were fraught with errors, allegedly by other scholars. So my question is this: what were the arguments and considerations that led the scholarly consensus to shift away from Nodika's dating to a significantly later date for the Neṣḥānā's composition? Additionally, what are the arguments from the scholarly consensus that support a later date for the Neṣḥānā's composition?
Okay, so good. Let's say that one very critical aspect of Nodika's theory was that he based his idea on the comparison between the Neṣḥānā and this metric homily, which Nodika attributed to Jacob of Sarug. Jacob of Sarug is a very important Syriac author, Syriac poet, and this homily is written in the meter used by Jacob of Sarug and had been traditionally attributed to Jacob of Sarug. So working on the assumption that Jacob had used the Neṣḥānā and that Jacob died in 521, Nodika came to the conclusion that this should be the terminus antequem, that is, before it must have been composed before 521. Nodika discarded because the Neṣḥānā includes a prophecy that refers to the 30s of the 7th century, and Nodika discarded this prophecy as a later addition. My suspect is that Nöldeke, who was really in need to prove the 6th century dating of the Neṣḥānā, because by the time he had already established his theory that the Dulcarnine pericope was derived from the Neṣḥānā. At the same time, if he had accepted a later dating around 630, this would have been critical for his chronology of the Quran. Okay, Nöldeke assumed that the Dulcarnine pericope predates the Hijra, and so taking seriously this second prophecy in the Neṣḥānā, which would suggest the text to be composed around 630, would be critical for his chronology. So, I mean, this is only a suspect, a feeling I have, of course, but I feel that there is very much this element at play in Nöldeke's theory. Unfortunately, later scholars soon understood that the attribution of the Syriac homily to Jacob of Serug was spurious. Okay. So, and from this observation, a consensus was little by little established that the Neṣḥānā was instead composed in the 7th century. And I would say, 2 scholars were particularly important to establish this consensus. First, the Hungarian scholar Csegledi. Okay. I hope I haven't mispronounced his name too badly, even if normally I spend a half of my life in Budapest. I still don't handle the Hungarian language, which is extremely difficult. So this Hungarian scholar Csegledi was the first one who wrote an article about the possible dating of to the 7th century, and then the many works by Reining starting from the 80s. So what Reining really added to the perspective to the question was an attempt to contextualize the text, and he built an entire theory to prove that the text would reflect the historical reality of the time of Heraclius. Okay, so it's not only the date of this second prophecy that relates the text to the 30s, 626, 630, I would say, according to Reining, is the reference to the historical scenario. And it is a very, I mean, I have been a partisan of this theory for many years, because Reining wrote pretty convincing, made some pretty convincing argument. However, when I started digging deeper into this text and investigated something that most people, I realized, didn't do, because we were also convinced that this text had been composed in the 7th century, that we completely disregarded the previous century. Which, however, is also directly referred to in the Neṣḥānā, because Alexander's prophecy includes a date to the 515. Okay, it's a bit like as we all had forgotten about this first reference, and we were all focusing on the second reference. Then, just out of curiosity, I asked myself, can it be that if I try to make some research about what was going on in the previous century, can I find a context which is as suitable as the 7th century? And the answer, to my surprise, was yes. And not only it was as suitable as the 7th century was, it was even more suitable, because I found many elements that from my perspective, prove that the Neṣḥānā is a product of the 6th, not of the 7th century. Okay? We can go into the specifics shortly, but let's say that the first question was then what should we do of the second date mentioned in the prophecy that connects the text to the 30s of the 7th century. And well, as scholars of this kind of texts know very well, it's very easy that predictions, prophecies get re-updated by second hands, coming and adding something. This is not an unusual phenomenon. So I asked myself if this was the case, and it happens that the text in that specific passage presents some syntactical problems with the grammar that doesn't make much sense, something that by itself already suggests that there was something that went wrong in the transmission. Well, I have a full chapter dedicated to proving that this second date in the Alexander's prophecy is an interpolation. Now we cannot enter into the specifics, but so I think that I could make some solid arguments, but the important thing was because if my theory had been based only on the observation that there is something wrong in this passage, maybe it's an interpolation, that would have been a very weak theory. Okay, so the task was just to create, not to create, it's not created, maybe it's not creating, maybe it's not the right term, but to prove that the 6th century was provided a better context than the 7th. And there were many elements, starting from the fact that, for instance, in the Neṣḥānā, the description of the invasions of the Huns, of Gog and Magog, refers to a geographical area that does not match that of the 7th century invasions, but only that of the 6th century. There are some names of Hunnic chiefs that coincide with those of Hunnic leaders in the 6th century. But above all, I realized that the question of the control over the mountain passages in the Caucasus, where, according to the tradition, Alexander had established his gate, or his iron gates, was a point of contention between the Byzantines and the Sasanians in the 6th century. It was such a thorny issue that it figures at the first as the first element in the peace treaties, in several peace treaties that Byzantines and Sasanians signed in the 6th century. Basically, the story, I have a full chapter on this. It's quite detailed. It's a long story, but the thing that went this way, Sasanians claimed that since they were controlling the place of the so-called Caspian Gates, Rome, they were protecting both Persian and Roman Empire from the invasions of nomadic tribes coming from Central Asia, and so they demanded money from the Romans. When the Romans rejected, this served as a casus belli for the open of hostility in several occasions. So what the Syriac author of the Alexander legend does is to resume this old legend of Alexander building iron gates and on the spot of the so-called Caspian Gates to rebut these Sasanian claims. So the idea, the motif of Alexander's gate is very much addressing the political context of the 6th century and the contentions, the disputes over the control of the Caucasian passes.
Yeah, and I found that chapter talking about the political context behind the Neṣḥānā to be extremely interesting. I read it a couple times, and it demonstrates that politics back then were just as messy as they are today, involving the Sasanians and the Romans and their defense or payment of the Caucasus passes, and which seemed to stem a couple centuries before the 6th century. We seem to only escalated in the 6th century because of numerous reasons that you lay out in your book. But one thing that I found a bit confusing, were there multiple Caucasus passes that the Persians and the Romans were defending? In your book, you mentioned the Dariali Gorge. You also mentioned Durban. The Caspian Gates. Now, I didn't look at a map as I was reading your book to kind of see where all these things are located. I know maybe some of them may overlap or in the same location, but I get the feeling that there are it's not just one pass in the Caucasus that the Sasanians were defending.
Okay, so mostly there were two main passes, one at Dariali and the other one at Durban. Okay, so and ancient authors were themselves confused about the terminology to design these two passes. So let's say that the Hunnic invasion of 515, mentioned in the first prophecy of Alexander in the Neṣḥānā, happened through the Dariali Pass, which is actually what Roman historians identified as the Caspian Gates. Okay. It's an invasion that then targeted Roman Armenia, the area around Belabitene, and all these geography matches of the Neṣḥānā. Okay, there was another possible route for these invasions. Okay, it's rather it's a bit more towards east. Towards the actual Caspian Sea, okay, through the pass of Derband, which is another place where Sasanians built fortifications, okay. The raids happened by the Turkic allies of Heraclius in the 7th century. We're talking, we're around the 626, 629. It's not a single raid. These are ongoing invasions. Happened through Durban. Okay. It's pretty interesting that from that moment onwards, we have a shift in the historical tradition about the location of the Alexander's Gate, which up to that point had been located at Dariali. But after, it seems we have some authors at least who identify the Derband, okay? Don't be worried if you're a bit confused about that, because you will be in good company. There are plenty of ancient authors who were asking themselves, and also recently modern scholars, but the Neṣḥānā, the geography of the Neṣḥānā matches the description of Dariali. We have elements that even I mentioned this in I think the first chapter about the geography behind the Neṣḥānā. We have elements that suggest that maybe the author had traveled to Dariali, or he had heard the stories about the description, but there are elements that would fit perfectly the geography and the landscape of Dariali. Yeah.
In terms of the sort of motifs within the Neṣḥānā, the story of the Egyptian blacksmith within the legend, how does that narrative provide additional insights into the socio-political landscape that influenced its composition during the 6th century? And from your perspective, which aspects of the blacksmith's tale stand out as particularly compelling challenges to the prevailing notion of the legend dating later and its historical context?
Okay. Thank you. I must say that sub-episode. I will just describe it quickly for the audience. So according to the Neṣḥānā, Alexander recruits 7,000 blacksmiths in Egypt, okay, passing when he passes by that country. And those same blacksmiths help him to edify this gate that he builds in the Caucasus. Okay. I always found this sub-episode a bit enigmatic because there are elements that are a bit unusual, I would say, starting from the very specific details that the author provides about the agreement that Alexander and this Egyptian king, Sarnakos, make, that is, okay, your blacksmiths come with me. After, when we are done with my travels, if they want, they can go back to Egypt. But if they want to stay with me, I will give them land in my territory, and they will not pay tribute to me. They will just give me custom duty. I was there. Wow, this is oddly detailed. I mean, if you know, I have a background in narratology, so the study of tales and the narrative structure of tales. And for the economy of the tale, it doesn't add anything. I mean, the fact that Alexander has to go to Egypt to recruit these blacksmiths doesn't add anything at all. The author could have just said, okay, there were blacksmiths with him, but it seems that Alexander needs to pass by Egypt, and that those blacksmiths must be coming from Egypt. Okay, and then there was this very odd detail about the custom duties, that why blacksmiths should pay custom duties instead of tribute. And I must say that I had so much fun when I started finding parallels in ancient sources. I realized that this was an adaptation of an ancient legend which is already certified in Herodotus, according to which an Egyptian pharaoh that in sources is called either Sesonkos or Sesostris, ends the Sarnakos of the Alexander legend. Okay, which is clearly derived from these Sesonkonis. This pharaoh would have started a campaign that led him to conquer a big part of the world, and he arrived in the area of the Colchis, which is modern Georgia, just where there is the Dariali Pass. And at that point, some of his soldiers decided to settle there, and this story would prove, according to Herodotus and then Diodorus Siculus, that the Colchis, the inhabitants of the Colchid area, are the descendants of those Egyptian soldiers, and would prove, among other things, where the Colchis practice circumcision, just like Egyptians, for instance. But so there was this idea that the inhabitants of that area were descending from those Egyptians, traveling with Sesonkos. Now, by the time the author of the Alexander legend was writing, this story was, to my surprise, even in late antiquity, it was very much present, and it was used in the context of the political quarrels between Sasanians and Romans over the kingdom of Lazica, which is the kingdom that occupied that geographical area. We have the Roman historian Agassiz, who refers to this story with an anti-Sasanian agenda. Lazica was another bone of contention between Byzantines and Sasanians. Okay, it's an endless conflict going on there, very much related to the question, to the issue of the Caspian Gates. Agesius refers to the story to prove that the Romans have the right to count Lazica in their sphere of influence, because the Lazis are the descendants of the Egyptians, and Egypt is a Roman territory. The author of the Neṣḥānā, who readapts the story, of course, for the necessity of the narration in the plot, these are not soldiers anymore, these are blacksmiths, but the broad outlines of the story are very well detectable. The author of the Neṣḥānā takes this to the next level, okay? He makes the point that, first of all, Alexander is the ancestor of the Romans. Alexander gave these blacksmiths territory in that area, and it was those blacksmiths who agreed to be linked to the empire of Alexander. And the question of paying the custom duty very much reflects the political situation of Lazica in that period, because the Lazis were not paying directly tribute to the Romans, but Roman officers were controlling the trade. Okay, and there are details that are very interesting. For instance, the 7,000 blacksmiths. The number 7,000 coincides with the number of soldiers that Justinian sent to Lazica to fight against the Persians. And there are all these small elements. So the author of the Neṣḥānā is using this legend to make a political claim about the question of Lazica, which was very much at the top of the contention between Romans and Sasanians in the 6th century. And even in another interesting aspect is that he connects this question of Lazica to that of the Caspian Gates. And here it's another thing that is common to what other commentators, political commentators, let's call them this way, of the time were doing. Procopius was doing exactly the same observation when linking Lazica and Caspian Gates, for instance.
Just moving on in terms of the core of your argument in the book. One of the key critical consensus that you're overturning is the idea that the legend of Alexander and the Neṣḥānā is a celebration of Heraclius, and you're actually arguing that it's a critique dating from the Byzantine ruler, the Justinian Byzantine ruler, and it's actually a critique of that ruler. Could you elaborate a little bit on the sort of the textual and thematic evidence that you use to support the interpretation that the text is in fact a critique and not a celebration?
Yeah, perfect. So, in fact, Alexander in the Neṣḥānā achieves all the things that Justinian failed to achieve. Okay? For instance, some kind of more assertive policy on the Persian border. Justinian became infamous among Byzantine subjects because of his custom to pay peace with gold, to the point that we are told by Roman historians of the time that men in Byzantine society were asking themselves if Rome had become a tributary state to the Persians. Okay, it's extremely interesting that in the Neṣḥānā we are told that after defeating this Persian king Tubarlak, which is not a real figure, I argue in my book that the name Tubarlak is some kind of pun, is to make fun of Khosrow. But this is not relevant here. But we read that after defeating Tubarlak, Alexander, instead of killing him and annexing his empire, he decides to sign a peace treaty according to which Persia will pay tribute to Rome. Which, I mean, we are not dealing with any kind of it's not a chronicle. So the author has not pretension to provide detailed elements that match the historical reality, but it doesn't make any sense if you think about that. Because by that time, everybody knew that historically Alexander had conquered Persia. This is an information that could hardly be ignored by the author. It was celebrated in historical chronicles, but also in the Alexander Romans. So why would you just, instead of having your hero conquering Persia after he defeated the enemy to the point that the enemy is in chain, on his knee, ready to be slaughtered, why would Alexander agree to have Persia paying tribute? This is in fact, a kind of reverse of the historical reality. As I mentioned, many in the Roman Empire had the impression that Justinian had been subjugated. And indeed, Justinian many times paid in gold the price of peace. We have evidence that the Roman diplomats were insisting that the payments would be made all together so that they would not look as a tribute. Tribute plays a very important role in Sasanian political culture. The ideology was that those who pay tribute to the Sasanians are subjects. Okay, so our author wanted to have Persia subjugated to Rome and paying tribute. So it's a bit like, to wash the insult, okay? But it's also a criticism of Justinian, because again, Alexander is represented as the idealized ruler who could achieve what Justinian is failing to achieve. So, and as for the idea of the celebration of Heraclius, oddly enough, that's true. Because what at least I argue in my book is that some decades later, probably 7 or 8 decades later, when this text was still read, okay, and we know that it was still read because we have evidence that somebody added a gloss to update the text and connect it to the historical reality of the time. Somebody must have seen this Alexander accomplishing these heroic deeds and looking around himself, saying, "Oh, this looks very much what Heraclius is doing, is accomplishing now." So a text, oddly enough, a text that had been composed to criticize the power, was received as some text that could glorify a new emperor, more glorious than Justinian. But this is not unusual. Just yesterday I had an interesting class with my students. We were reading the prophecies, the divisions in the book of Daniel, and which were composed to predict the fall, the disgrace of the Seleucid ruler. Okay. However, a few centuries later, those same prophecies were interpreted as a celebration of the Roman power and destiny to reign over the world. So these texts very often are conceived in a way and then they are received in another way.
Very interesting. And just moving on to some of the other themes and motifs that are in the Neṣḥānā, the Danielic prophecy in regards to the Christianization of Alexander, the transformation of Alexander's image through scriptural interpretation, particularly as conversions to Christianity increased, in the Roman Empire is intriguing. Can you elaborate on how this shift in perception, merging the classical topos of the Imitatio Alexandri with Christian interpretations of the Danielic prophecy, influenced the portrayal of Alexander as a king guided by divine providence in the Syriac legend?
Yeah, this is very interesting because at some point, Roman intellectuals were exposed to a different representation of Alexander. Okay, so after Constantine's conversion, we are not sure that he actually converted, but please allow me to use this term, as in this moment I can't find a better one. Let's say conversion or acceptance of Christianity. An increasing number of Roman intellectuals had started reading the Bible and commentaries on the Bible. Now, Alexander plays a role in the Bible. I mean, it's not directly mentioned, but there is an allusion, a twofold. There are actually three allusions to Alexander, Alexander's kingdom in the Danielic prophecies. So at that point, starting from the 4th century, Roman intellectuals, not only Christian intellectuals, but also, let's say, pro-Roma, pro-imperial intellectuals had to deal also with this other image of Alexander, that is as an Alexander that is acting, following God's will. Okay, so and we have a very interesting case that somehow anticipates that of the Alexander legend in Neṣḥānā in Afrahat. Afrahat was a Syriac writer living in the Persian Empire during the persecutions by the Sasanian king Shapur. When Shapur heard that the Roman Empire was opening to Christianity, he started persecuting Christians in his own empire because they could act as a fifth column. Okay, Afrahat, who was a member of this community persecuted at the time, started looking at Constantine as a possible savior, ignoring that by the time Constantine had already passed away. But he wrote interpretations of the Book of Daniel that are very much oriented towards this idea that Alexander was part of a divine plan to destroy Persia, and making the point that the kingdom of Alexander and the Roman Empire are a single unity in Roman history, in the Danielic schema, and that Rome, the heir of Alexander, will repeat the deeds of its mythical ancestor and once again defeat Persia. So we have here a very interesting beginning of this commission between Imitatio Alexandri, if you want, at least the idea that there will be a Roman emperor that will repeat the deeds of Alexander, but also contextualized in the framework of a sacred history and read the light of these Danielic prophecies. And this is very much what we find later in the Neṣḥānā, where this phenomenon culminates. The Neṣḥānā is the first text, at least to my knowledge, in which Alexander is described as a pious Christian king, okay? A real Christian before Christ, okay? It's a bit like, here I borrow an expression that I heard my friend Gabriel Said Reynolds using, that it's a bit like as Syriac Christians baptized Alexander, okay? This is the first text in which we have this image of Alexander as a Christian monotheist king. Although we have a previous reapproachment between Alexander and Judaism, Alexander and Christianity, but this is the real culmination of the process.
So moving on to the sort of the motif of Alexander's horns, it's one of the most sort of controversial aspects of the Neṣḥānā text, particularly in its relationship with the Quran. So how do we believe that the motif of the horn first became associated with Alexander? And is there any historical evidence suggesting that Alexander himself adopted or endorsed this sort of symbolism? And what is the most ancient material evidence we have linking him to that image?
Okay, so thank you. Excellent question. So historically, horns were a symbol of the Egyptian god Ammon. Okay, and we know that very soon the symbolism was associated with Alexander. Alexander conquered Egypt. He was declared pharaoh, probably, if memory serves me well. We do not know if Alexander ever tried to wear these horns. We have authors claiming that way. We don't know. What we know for sure is that the image of Alexander with the ram horns appears very soon on the coins minted by Alexander's successors. It's not only on old coinage, then we have statues. It became an image that must have been quite familiar to people in the ancient world. We have talking about Imitatio Alexandri, there were imitators of Alexander like Mithridates, the king of Pontus, that had some coins representing him with the horns like Alexander. We know that somebody disliked this, especially Christians. We have evidence from the 3rd century of Clemens of Alexandria accusing Alexander of destroying the beauty of the humans created as created by God by wearing this pagan symbolism. Obviously, the polemic had religious connotations because this was considered to be a pagan symbolism. So we have a reference to these horns in the Alexander Romans, but not associated with Alexander. They're associated with Pharaoh Neṣḥānā, that according to the Romans was the father. It's fictional. We have only a passage in which Alexander is referred to as the horned king. Okay, but for sure, people at the time knew. Were conscious about the symbol. Now, it's very much interesting that all the evidence we have is that the Christians did not like it. Okay, again, because it was a pagan symbol. Probably, again, we don't know where when the Syriac translation of the Alexander Romans was produced, but I think it's interesting that the author does not translate the only passage in which Alexander is called the horned king. Maybe there was this hostility towards the symbolism. What is sure is that the author of the Neṣḥānā reinterprets this symbol of the horns in a Christian way, connecting it to scripture. He connects and it's pretty evident when one reads the Syriac text. He's basically using the terms that are used in the Peshitta, the Syriac Bible, to translate a few biblical passages, including Micah, passage in Micah, and in Daniel, in the book of Daniel. Now, there is an interesting thing that the author is here using a well-determined literary strategy that occurs again and again in his work. He takes a motif from the classical tradition and he reads it in light of scripture, and he uses it in the framework of anti-Sasanian polemic. Because, as I argue in my book, also the horn, the way the horn symbolism, the way the author uses it, has anti-Sasanian connotations. Now, this is important because it tells us that we are dealing with a modus operandi that is typical of one author. Okay, so we have the author's fingerprints on the way this motif of the horns is transformed, and the way it is mixed with biblical references, but also the way in which the motif, the ancient motif of Alexander's gate, is developed. Also, I didn't mention it earlier, but the motif of the Alexander's gate, we know from ancient sources that people believe that Alexander had established these iron gates in the Caucasus, the Caspian gates of the tradition. The author transforms these iron gates into a gate of iron and bronze, with a reference to Daniel symbolism. You see, it's the same procedure, that of the horns and that of the gates. And to some extent, also the story of the blacksmiths, as far as I could tell, there were not biblical references, but again, it's taking an ancient story and reading it at the light of the present. So what does this tell us? That most likely the story of Alexander's gate, as we know it, as it became famous, the apocalyptic gate, that is not only iron gates preventing nomadic population from coming. This is an apocalyptic gate that prevents Gog and Magog. It's the fusion of the iron and the bronze, Rome and Macedonia. Most likely, this story originates with the author of the Neṣḥānā himself. Although the author is using more ancient traditions, the way in which the story became famous is the product of this author. We are dealing with a specific literary procedure that occurs again and again in this work.
Very interesting. And it seems like it has a lot to do with not the gates or the horns per se, but what they're made out of is supposed to symbolize, is supposed to have some type of symbolism behind it that you find in many traditions. I found that aspect extremely, extremely interesting. And this question that we have right here was actually submitted by one of our audience members, and it's related to exactly what you just explained. Hopefully you didn't already explain certain aspects of it, but I'll ask anyway. In chapter 9 in your book, you sought to explain why the Syriac Alexander romance did not translate or include the term horned king, suggesting that the absence of this passage might indicate hostility towards the image of Alexander bearing horns of the Egyptian god Ammon. However, the person who submitted this question found this explanation a bit unsatisfactory. While the text seems comfortable including references to Zeus and other pagan deities, why would there be hesitation regarding Alexander being labeled the Horned King? Can you elaborate on the specific nuances of this term Horned King and how its treatment in the Syriac Alexander romance differs from other pagan motifs present in the text?
No, that's a fair point. I mean, I should say that this observation I made does not play any significant role in my theory. I say that maybe the fact that this translator excluded that point might reveal the same hostility. So maybe yes, maybe not. I mean, the reason I could say why excluding it is because one thing is to make reference to Zeus, to Ammon. One thing is to mention an Egyptian pharaoh who wears horns. Another thing is having your hero, the hero of your work, directly associated with the symbolism. I mean, it's not really a main element of the discussion there. So I take the criticism as a fair point. I mean, it may be not, but it's not that important.
Okay. And We talked a lot about Christians in this topic and during this discussion, but there are one community that really I didn't think too much about until the other day. And so I composed a question, if you don't mind answering. How would Jews in the Middle East perceive Alexander in the 7th century late antiquity, especially in light of Alexander being used as a propaganda tool in the Byzantine-Sasanian War?
Okay, this is a big question. The image Alexander in Judaism is very complicated, and maybe I'm not the most qualified person to answer, because it's a topic that in itself would require an entire line of research. What I could ascertain in my research is that, for instance, in the Babylonian Talmud, Alexander appears both as a positive and a negative character. Okay, we have evidence of attempts, like for instance by Josephus, to present Alexander as more friendly to Judaism. We have this famous story of Alexander's visit to Jerusalem, where he would have acknowledged the authority of the God of the Jewish people. Okay, these are, of course, spurious fake stories, fake news circulated to promote the interests of the community. So how Alexander was received by Jews in connection to his figure as a Christian king, this will be a very interesting area of investigation in sources, later sources. I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer to this. What I know for sure is that another community didn't take it well, this association between Alexander and the Roman empires, namely Zoroastrians. So we can see in Middle Persian sources this demonization of the character of Alexander that extremely interestingly, at least in one source, of which now I don't recall the title. It was edited and translated by Carlo Ceretti. Alexander is defined as the ecclesiastical, the Christian Alexander. And in my view, here, Middle Persian sources are being under the influence of this new trend established in the Roman world, starting at least with the author of the Neṣḥānā. It's a bit like as here, then we can debate whether it was the author himself who triggered this, or if he was part of a more general phenomenon that it was in an embryonic stage and then exploded. But from the Neṣḥānā onwards, at least talking about documentary evidence, we witness this kind of Alexander Renaissance, from which Alexander emerges as a Christian ruler inspired by God. And this is an image that became really prominent first among Syriac Christians and in Syriac apocalyptic production of the 7th century, notoriously also as an answer to the rise of Islam, and then also in Western medieval literature.
So finally, moving on to sort of the religious community that is the focus of the religious tradition, that is the focus of this particular channel, you very explicitly stated in the introduction to your book that you had chosen not to examine the Quran's intertextual relationship with the Neṣḥānā, and that you hope to explore this in a future work. What factors led to that decision, And can you give us maybe a little bit of a sneak preview of the sort of conclusions you envisage drawing in that future work?
Okay, so first of all, the decision was mostly motivated by a more general feeling being bored of Quranic studies in general. It's just a very controversial field, and it's just it's not let's say that writing about Quranic origins is not my priority right now. Although I must say that the Quran has this odd power on me. It constantly attracts me back, so I can't escape to its charm. But what my position on this currently. I haven't been thinking about the question of Dhul-Qarnayn for a while. The point is, we should clarify a few things. First of all, there are a number of connections between the Neṣḥānā and the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope that cannot be limited to the fact that Alexander has horns and the protagonist in the Quran has an epithet of the two-horned one. It can't be limited to the fact that there is the story of a gate built to confine Gog and Magog. So the common points are much deeper, and I will just list a few. So first of all, in the Neṣḥānā, we have a blending of previous traditions that are not, at least in sources, in previous sources, are not mixed together. They do not come together, these traditions. So as far as the evidence tells us, the author of the Neṣḥānā was the first one who had the idea of taking these ancient stories of Alexander's journeys to the edges of the world, which have a very complicated story. I'm writing a book on that right now. Maybe we can talk very little about that later, but there are these ancient stories of Alexander that probably have their roots in the ancient Gilgamesh epic. As far as we know, there was no attempt to connect the stories to the motif of the Iron Gates. So we already have some kind of editorial work, which is also reflected not only from the elements that we find in the Neṣḥānā, it's also reflected in the elements that we don't find in the Neṣḥānā. Because it's pretty evident that the author made some cuts, excluded a few episodes that he didn't like. He excluded an episode about Alexander trying to reach paradise, and most likely he excluded also this story of the water of life. Although this is something I'm writing about now, there is also the possibility, actually it's more probable, that the original Neṣḥānā included the story of the water of life, and then the 7th century redactor deleted this topic as well. But this is a very difficult philological analysis. That's not the point. So what is relevant is that we have a combination of previous traditions, which is not certified elsewhere in previous sources, and we have also the exclusion of certain elements. Okay. Now, then we focus on certain elements within this new melange of sources. And when we zoom in, we see that also the specific elements are elaborated in a way that has no antecedents, and as I mentioned, should probably be considered the product of the pen of the author of the Neṣḥānā. We have these iron gates that become a gate of iron and bronze, and this is mostly out of the reading at the light of the biblical symbolism in Daniel, but above all, to refer to the ideology that the author elaborates. And we have the characterization of this horned king as a pious prophet. Okay? Now, all these elements are at play in the Quran. Okay? We have an exact reflection of the editorial work that the Syriac author did, combining together stories that were not mixed. We don't have the exactly same episode that the author has excluded. We have the characterization of this horned king as a divinely inspired king. And above all, we have this gate made of iron and bronze, or iron and brass. You choose the word. In Syriac, there is no difference. So it's a bit like, how is the say? If it swings like a duck, it acts like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, then maybe it's a duck. So that's the thing. After that, so there are two more things to say, because there have been some attempt to rebut these connections, although not in the last version with the last insights that I just mentioned. I had written previously, and admittedly my argument was weaker because I lacked these new elements that came out of my extensive analysis of the Neṣḥānā. But so I've seen that there was a trend to focus on very small details and looking for elements that do not match into to discard the connection between the two stories. And this raises a more general question that does not concern the Quran alone. It's just what is our level of tolerance of difference? How to what extent we can tolerate differences in the stories. And this is a question that, for instance, can be asked about biblical passages in connection with ancient and Near Eastern stories. I read recently a very inspiring study by, unfortunately, I forgot whom. It's quite old. It was published, I think, in the 90s, about the question of to what extent we can tolerate minor differences to exclude the possibility that there is a connection. And this author, whose name I'm shamefully forgetting, is somebody who wrote extensively about the Gilgamesh epic, made the point that we have translations or readaptations of the Gilgamesh epic in other languages than Akkadian, like I don't remember even the languages, but we have adaptation of the Gilgamesh epic in other ancient languages. The plot doesn't match sometimes exactly word by word that of the Akkadian text. This is a good reason to say that this doesn't come from the Gilgamesh epic, and the answer is no. Because here we are not talking about authors, and in the specific case of the connection with the Quran, we're not talking about an author who was sitting at the desk with a manuscript of the Neṣḥānā and the dictionary, Syriac into Arabic, and translating literally. Here we are talking about transmission between text. After that, we can ask ourselves, what is the source? in my understanding, when I mention a source, and this is something that in the future I should clarify better, I'm not meaning necessarily that this is a transmission happened via written methods. By a source, I mean that this is the starting point. Okay, so as far in my understanding, the Neṣḥānā is some kind of starting point of a new reconceptualization of previous legends about Alexander that became quite widespread. This text had a certain success in the 7th century. And among the sources that are influenced by this text, there is the Quranic pericope. Now, the question of how the transmission happened, it's related, but that's the next level of the investigation. There are many elements which are interesting, for instance. I could notice that the Quran appears to include elements that, very minor elements, that are found in other Syriac sources inspired by the Neṣḥānā, which tells us that probably by the time we already had a certain more broader tradition inspired by this text. Okay. However, I simply do not think that the connection can be denied. I mean, one needs, so far, the only attempts I've seen to deny this connection focus on very small and almost irrelevant elements between the two stories, and do not almost try to elude the overwhelming evidence that would point in the other direction.
You know, I really would agree with you on that, because looking at a question that was submitted to me when an audience member found out we were interviewing you, a lot of what you said sounds like you were answering this question that was submitted to. I'm very hesitant in asking because I don't want to open up a whole new can of worms, because I know I know time is of the essence, but you know, it deals with. Okay. The question that was submitted. I'm
curious at this point.
Okay, all right. The question that was submitted, it's in one of your footnotes. You said, note that the Syriac language does not distinguish between bronze and brass. Consequently, Arabic term, I'm probably going to butcher this, kitter, brass, in Quran 1896 appears as an exact translation of the Syriac word for bronze and brass. This person found your wording exact translation to be misleading, especially when Arabic does have a cognate to the Neṣḥānā's usage of nahasa, which is nuhas, not kitar. Because kitar is more used in the process of liquefying copper, i.e. molten copper. In that perspective, could you argue that the Syriac does not have this distinction on meaning, but Quran uses kitar instead of nu'as, specifically, which is puzzling if one follows the logic? This person did a test. This person tested this idea out to see if most Arabic-speaking Christians use that word, especially Christians who have a tradition of translating materials from the Syriac language. This person found one from the 9th century manuscript, Vat R13 of 1 Corinthian. All this stuff is very technical. I'm sorry. You might understand it, but some of it's going over my head.
I'm familiar with the argument. I read it. I mean, honestly. So in Italian, we have a saying to describe this kind of situation. We say that somebody's trying to climb over the mirrors, to say that it's very slippery. It's a bit like, I mean, the point is that what is the goal here? Is the goal try to, again, get as close as possible to what is historically plausible? Or the goal here is to deny that the Quran has sources? in the human world. Because it looks to me that if the goal is the ladder, then yeah, you can present all these kind of arguments that are really a bit stubborn, if you want, really going into the details. But I will give you another example. So, with my wife at home, we speak English. She knows some Italian, but I would say that just to say that I am not completely bilingual, but I very often and I teach in English. So English, although with all the Italian accent and everything, is becoming the language that I use more often. Let's assume I go to a movie in Italian, and then I go back home and I tell my wife, oh, I watched this movie, and she asks me, what was it about? Will I pay attention to every single word I say to pick the exact word to provide an accurate translation? Or I would just give a general description? Okay, now, admittedly,
I'll add, if English, it was my wife, she would pay attention to every exact word. She speaks multiple languages and teach English as a second language, so she does it to me all the time.
But you're working on the assumption that your wife already knows the original. What if she does? And if you're the one who is transmitting? But okay, admittedly, there is a problem with what I just said, because English and Italian are not so close. Let's say that I watch a movie in French, which has a much more shared vocabulary with Italian than English. I think if I had to report to a third person what the movie I just watched is about, I really wouldn't pay that much level of attention to every single word I'm using. So again, we are not talking about an author who was translating with a dictionary. And again, if you compare these very small elements to the overall picture, it becomes almost insignificant. And I'm sorry, I really don't mean to offend anyone, but it's a bit grotesque, if you want, to just stuck to these small details. And or at least the scholars, if scholars or whatever, for sure. I mean, the person who came up with this idea has some very admirable linguistic skills. I will consider this, but then this person should answer about how do we explain all the other elements that appear, at least to my eyes, much more relevant than these details.
So it seems like it's probably more important to look at the bigger picture, and that if you focus on these little smaller details, yes, you could probably argue or try to argue away from everything that's established based on a lot of commonalities and developing, evolving traditions. But, really, what are you trying to do when you focus on these small points? At least that's what I took away from what you just said.
I mean, focusing on the small points has a lot of merits. The moment in which we are not allowing the focus on the detail to blind us. Okay, so the focus on the detail at this stage can help us to answer other questions, like was the author of the Quranic pericope translating a text directly? Did he have a written text? Was he translating this text? Then this linguistic observation can help us maybe to discard this hypothesis, which I honestly never, as far as I remember, I hope I'm not contradicting myself, but as far as I remember, I've never read anywhere that the transmission happened in writing. Okay? So the small detail can help us to further refine our view once we already established that the transmission happened. But this small detail should be taken as an element to discard all the rest. Then one must work much harder.
All right. Thank you for that. And I believe that's all of our questions. Although, you know, this topic is so expansive, there's more things that I could ask. I mean, even in my mind right now, I'm thinking of things based on what you just said. But I'm gonna leave it where we're at right now, not to take up too much more of your time. And I recommend
a third podcast.
A third podcast, definitely, because I'm interested in seeing how this develops. And there's just so many more topics that could be, or things that could be explored from your book, from this topic, that could probably fill libraries for the next 10 to 20 years. So yeah, I'm, you know, if you're open to another podcast on the subject, based on.
In this moment, I'm writing this other book. Let's see where it takes me and when it's done.
And, you know, another topic that I'm interested in is how Muslim scholarship received this or understood the Syriac legend of Alexander. I mean, it's a topic I haven't seen explored too much. You can find Wikipedia articles on it and maybe other similar writings, but just how Muslim scholarship kind of understood the Syriac legend, because it seems like it was accepted that Dhul-Qarnayn was Alexander by earlier Muslim scholarship, but only of recent times did this kind of change. So you know, it would be interesting to read how the ideas of Alexander and Dhul-Qarnayn kind of developed from Islam's inception or earliest exegesis to where we're at in recent times.
So it's a topic that I never explored extensively. Because I mean, for obvious reasons, one cannot investigate the whole.
Yeah, time is limited.
Process. But what clearly appears is that first, Quranic commentators like Muqatil bin Suleiman and the first Arab historians had no doubts that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander. Okay. Doubts came later.
And it wasn't by even Muslims, from what I've been reading, that it wasn't Muslims who first put forth this idea that, okay, it wasn't Alexander, it was Cyrus, but it was an Orientalist who kind of played with this idea, and then Muslim scholarship kind of attached themselves to it.
No, actually. So the already Tabari is very much hesitant. He reports several possibilities for the identity of Dhul-Qarnayn. I mean, there are several factors at play. For instance, we see that, if I'm not wrong, in the Kitab at-Tijan, Dhul-Qarnayn is presented as one king from Yemen, and this has been convincingly. I mean, it has been convincingly argued that this identification of Dhul-Qarnayn with Yemenite kings had its roots in a very precise social and historical environment. And then there was also, I mean, I have a dossier of sources. I remember clearly of some historian at some point, I don't remember who exactly, but we are around the 9th century, clearly saying, no, Dhul-Qarnayn is not Alexander. Alexander was not behaving that well, or something like that.
Okay.
So, but the real problem is that at some point there was a mismatch between the typology of Alexander that the Quran had inherited, that of the Christian prophet, and the mismatch with the historical Alexander. So, and this complicated things. Yeah.
All right. On that note, if you have any final words for us, we can conclude this podcast. And we thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your work. It was a very exciting read. It was thought-provoking. I had to reread certain chapters over again to understand it. Well, I understood it, but it was just so dense with information that I wanted to come away with a clearer understanding. So I recommend people to read your book, because podcasts never do justice for the publications that the people we bring on put out. And so we always recommend people to, watch the podcast, of course, but please also engage with the author or the guest that we bring on work, because that's where the fruit of what we're talking about is at.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure, as usual.
Oh, yeah, of course. And I hope to speak to you again, and we'll see how this topic of the Syriac legend of Alexander and the dual carnane pericope develops. So thank you, Dr. Tesei, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.